Okay, good afternoon. Why are you here? In this afternoon when the class is full, I was kind of impressed that I don't know what is the reason, but suddenly everybody is sitting in the front rows, not in the back rows. On behalf of Riga Business School, I'm very pleased to have you here today. What we kind of start and we'll hope to make it into a tradition with the help of our supporters and friends, that we are inviting speakers from the top universities around the world to exchange ideas about how the educational space will develop, what is happening between education and industry, and some also interesting things. And this morning we had a nice session on how the innovation and interdisciplinarity works in one of the top universities of the world, meaning Harvard, University of Harvard. And we are very honored to have a very distinguished speaker today who personally has a career, kind of interdisciplinary career. As I counted, she has degrees in psychology, architecture, economics, management, arts, and some others were there. And to make it on the top, which probably would put any higher education administrator laying flat on the floor in this country, she is working for the School of Engineering, University of Harvard. So there is kind of the questions how it works. But I think our very distinguished speaker brings to this audience something she does also, is she is interested in the very, I think, simple question, why do people like things? And what she refers to as desirability, and she runs an initiative in Boston, Desirability Lab. How do you make things desirable for people to have? Starting with food. Also, she helps out companies like Uber to have, how do the clients like Uber? And things like that. And I think that will be the topic what we have here. How do you innovate with the design so that people like what you have innovated? And that, I think, is the topic of today. And before I introduce the speaker, as technical formality, we'll have an hour here. So I'll be very sharp in cutting the questions short at the very end. And then everybody is invited for a brief lunch on the other side of this atrium. So please feel free to come to discuss what you heard, ask some further questions, and things like that. So without further ado, Beth Altringer from University of Harvard School of Engineering.
Great. Thank you. Hello. See some familiar faces. Thank you for coming.
Followers.
This is exciting. I'm also on my second, maybe third coffee this morning, so hopefully I feel the jitters a little bit. But okay. So today, I loved what we talked about this morning, but I really love talking about our projects and how we get there. And so our agenda for this talk is going to start with just an overview of innovation via design research. You can also think of this as design thinking or human-centered design. It goes by many names, but for our purposes, we're talking about the same thing today. And then the plan is to get pretty practical and talk through some examples of how that process works. So we start with framing your project strategy, and then revising your understanding of the problem, and then conducting interviews, usually observational data, synthesizing that, and trying to arrive at a genuinely novel insight that you can then build something on top of. We'll talk a little bit about why this process, design thinking, is new and why that matters and kind of change the game. And then a couple of cautions about what design thinking is not quite, but then that often gets confused. A couple of very lightweight tips and tricks, and if people want more information, you can get in touch and I can show you where to find some more information. And then a little bit about what I think is the future of this field. So that's where we're going, and we'll just start with the overview. So human-centered design, this field really originated in the Bay Area with a company called IDEO in the 90s. And this firm was really special in that it was founded by already successful professionals in engineering, design, and in behavioral science. So this was the first design firm to include behavioral scientists, so psychologists, anthropologists, etc., at the beginning of a design process. That was really novel at the time. And a sense of how successful these people were at the beginning, Bill Moggridge had the patent for a screen that folds over a laptop. So these are really, really successful people. And they came together. Another really unique thing that they did was make it explicitly collaborative. So they closed their individual star design offices and built a new one where their ego was about the collective organization rather than the famous designer. That was really, really new at the time. Many of the founders of IDEO also taught at Stanford in the engineering school, and eventually created the Stanford Institute of Design, which is often called the D School. And the D School became kind of their educational arm that taught a lot of people around the world about this method. So today, this is kind of common terminology, but I just want to remind everybody that it isn't that long that we've been here, and that this method was really, really new in some important ways. So I want to start, I think the best way to talk about design thinking is through examples. So I want to start us off with a question: who are cities designed for? So I want you to just kind of think, people, hopefully, yeah. All right, so we could start with that as an answer. They're designed for people. Great. So there are multiple ways that you might approach innovation. And if we're talking about cities, some of this says you can invent based on the technology, kind of so like some kind of robotic bus or something, and then just try to make people like it. You could follow what industry leaders say, listen to your own intuition, or create things that are sort of on brand, or you can do what we're going to be talking about today, which is a different approach. So the initial premise of human-centered design was to really listen to people and to study them before you even invent for them. And the reason that we go and talk to people is because it's not because they know how to tell us what should happen in the future, but they are the closest to the actual need. And they often know what needs solving. They know about current alternative solutions, and they are ultimately the people who will adopt or ignore whatever you put out in the market. So historically, what would often happen with innovation is we would focus on technology and business, and we would sort of ignore a little bit the study of the human side. And then what design thinking did was bring all of these together and say that, this is really where we want to be, is fully at that intersection. So when you think of the founding of IDEO, they had, world-renowned engineering, world-renowned behavioral scientists, world-renowned business people come together. So they were kind of living their model also in their hiring. So when we think about it in my lab, we really kind of focus on the desirability intersection of that, and we focus on products and services. We are very research-based. It seems like that makes more sense inside of an institution, so we really leverage what we can from research that may not fit into what Stanford originally called design thinking. And then we spend a lot of time training people to work with diverse others and design for diverse others. So another way that this has been conceptualized is there's a sequential design process of you define the problem, you listen to people, this is where you do your interviews and observation, you create the idea, you implement it. In practice, this isn't so sequential as that. It's actually much more of an iterative process. It's quite hard to diagram as well. But this is more what we tend to think about when we're talking about this process. And then there's also kind of an emotional process that we go through. And IDEO uses a graphic like this often. And it's kind of fun initially, and then you get really overwhelmed by unstructured data. And you have this kind of happy face here and the sad face here. And this is where you get into the sad face part of the experience. And then you kind of find a way to recover out of it. And they often show their clients this right at the beginning to say, we're going to go through some challenging times later on in the project, and that's normal. And there's human-centered design, and design thinking is entering a research phase as well. So you can see that there are interesting papers where this methodology is being used for engineering problems. So that's an overview of what it is that we're talking about. Sometimes I also describe this to my students as this is a process of kind of constant, ongoing decision-making that's kind of built for risky types of problems. And we're always asking, what is desirable? So in our city example, we say people, but really we kind of have to get a little more specific than that. Who specifically do we mean? It's very hard to generally design for people. You have constant unknowns, and you also have a lot of interdependencies where this team's work will affect this team's work and this team's work, and it's kind of happening simultaneously, but you don't have control over all of it. You have disengagement risks during the project. So, people can lose motivation, or organizational politics can be kind of messy. And then you have product failure risks about whether people adopt your solutions or not. And all of these decisions are also prone to different biases that we may have about, say, who a city should be designed for, or who a beer commercial should be targeting, etc. And so structured methods can kind of help us in an environment of uncertainty and risk to become more aware of our biases and kind of question those assumptions systematically. And so design thinking is just one method to do that, and its value is really in the fact that it provides some structure to decision making in this type of when the goal is innovation. Okay. So the next thing is framing up a strategy. So we're going to come back to the city example later, but I want to introduce another example. So I like beer. I actually quite like beer a lot. And I don't know the women in the room who here likes beer. Right? How do you feel like most beer marketing is targeting you, or you just kind of happen to like beer in an environment that nobody's really talking to you about whether you might like beer or not? So for the most part, beer companies focus a little disproportionately on the male market. And that can make a lot of sense. So SAB Miller is going to be our example. This is a real example. Has tried to design for women a number of times. If women like beer, similarly to men, it's doubling your market. So that's attractive. But a lot of their attempts were like a pink beer, or little tiny beer, or fruity beer, or low-calorie beer. This is the pink it and shrink it model of innovation for women, and not very effective, it turns out. And some executives came across a statistic. This was actually from Tanzania at the time, that in that market, so especially in that market, there's an assumption in industry that women don't like beer very much. And they are basing that on bar data, so whether women order beer at bars. And they came across a statistic that suggested that in the home, women consume beer very similarly to men, but it's very it's somehow different in the bar. And this executive brought that up in a global executive retreat. And a couple of other executives said, well, we should investigate that. If that's true, that questions our assumptions. And that may mean that this market is larger than we have assumed. And so they began calling up people in their distributor network that are either distributing to bars or the home, and they found more validation for this statistic. But they still didn't understand why. So I wonder what you think. What do you think?
Women
Yeah.
maybe don't want more than what they are because they are shame or something.
Sure, yeah. So if you are an executive, how do you begin to address this? So it seems like we might have some decision-making biases or stereotypes that are framing our decision-making so far. We've come across some data that challenges it. We've tested a little bit, sort of validated that there might be something to that. Now what, right? Great. So how do we figure out what they would like, right? So these are glasses might matter. Anyway, this is what I love so much about this as a field. This is all testable. Like we can run experiments and all this. And so this is when framing initial strategy, this is a tool that I often give my students. So they need to figure out what kind of design research they're going to do. And often we want to start here, generative, and just come up with a solution. Oh, let's make a pink beer. That'll be great. They'll love it, you know? But there are also these other pieces. So contextual is asking the question of how do participants even experience this situation? So that would be asking, how do women experience the choice of beverage at home and in a bar, probably at a specific time of day? And we might try to really understand just that situation for the choice. Explanatory is when some unexpected thing has happened. So in this case, we have this data point that is unexpected and challenges our assumptions. So we would need to design a little design thinking study based on validating or invalidating that surprising data point. Evaluative is at the point where you begin to have a concrete hypothesis to test. And that starts to look more like a scientific method than a design thinking kind of study. Design thinking studies are very good for these, but this is usually more quantitative. But you can't just send a survey, given the question that we have right now about how women like beer. It's kind of a nonsensical survey to send out because we don't know enough about design the questions to answer this, about how they even experience it. So we need more unstructured data is probably what we're going to need first before we can get smarter about that. So in this specific case, they spend more time interviewing people who own bars in their distributor network or little grocery stores. And one thing they find is that in a lot of the places where women don't drink beer in bars, the bathroom either doesn't exist or is kind of gross. And they start to have a hypothesis. So the countries we're focused on, again, are like Tanzania, Zambia, Peru. So these are a lot of rural bars. And then they develop a hypothesis that the bathroom is related to the drink choice in bars. And they actually run a pilot study where they build a bathroom, because they often have in their distributor network, they have the bars on both sides of the street. And so it's kind of perfect for this little test. And lo and behold, they find that when you add a bathroom and maintain it well, women choose beer more like they do at home. So that's a pretty wild place to end up as S.A.B. Miller, right? It's very, very different from a pink beer or a little tiny beer, but shows better results. And that's really interesting. And so at this phase, they're actually creating the bathrooms themselves. That's not the business that SAB Miller wants to be in. And so they just added to the checklist. They already have people that go around to these bars and check that they're selling, this type of stock and whatnot. They just added the bathroom cleanliness, and existence of the bathroom to the checklist. So really, really cheap solution as well. So I think that's pretty cool. And these are just some statistics about women actually like beer a lot in different countries. But starting off with ideas, so when we start off with the pink it and shrink it stuff, we're often starting off with biases, unintentionally. But if you can't answer some of these questions ahead of time, you might want to go back and start a design thinking process to make sure you really understand how people like what they like in that situation. And I think we've kind of talked about these, so I'm going to skip past it. Okay, so revising your problem understanding. So we're going to go back to the city example now. And that city example started with who cities are designed for. And I'm going to add who are cities well designed for, right? Because yes, they're designed for people, but are they designed better for some people than other people? And for who? For car owners. Yeah, that's an interesting point of view. And I think you can find a lot of data that support that. But is that who we wanted to design cities well for? And so the flip side of that, if that's what we're going forward with, is that maybe they're not very well designed for pedestrians. And gosh, maybe we do want a more human scale mobility city. If that's the case, then we need to do some things to learn more and come up with ideas and get the momentum behind those ideas to create that kind of change. So this is a picture. This was New York City a long time ago. And this is kind of interesting to me because in those days, the city was actually pretty human scale. Like there's a lot of diversity of the projection quality is not very crisp with the light on up here, but you have, you have people moving on buggies and whatnot. You have commerce happening. It's all kind of happening in the same space. Yes, it's maybe a little chaotic, but there's something kind of human about that maybe we've lost a little bit, at least in New York City. You also have some evidence that there are some dangers for some populations that are a little bit disproportionately experienced. And that may be a way that some cities are sort of maybe better designed for some people than others late at night, for example. There are some researchers that studied whether safer looking neighborhoods are more lively. So they're starting to think about that hypothesis that maybe some people don't feel comfortable in some parts of the city at some times, and that may matter if our goal is to get that kind of vibrant human movement again. Have you heard of Jane Jacobs? She was a environmental researcher, and she argued in the 60s that urban renewal efforts didn't respect the needs of most residents. That was in the 60s. And now, we're still having this conversation. But in the 60s, we didn't have the large-scale data science tools that we have today. And so many researchers are starting to ask similar questions that she was asking in those days, but provide answers with data. And they're more or less proving her right. So every city is different. Without data, it was very hard to prove at the time, but we're finding out differently now. So safe-looking design, researchers are finding that that actually makes a big difference, especially for women and especially for people over 50. That's a lot of the proportion combined. That's most people, right? And that gives us a pretty specific answer to at least some of the people we're not designing cities as well for right now. And, the people over 50 piece of that is going to be all of us at some point. And perceived safety, this is what they found, modulates the active population in an area with effects that depend on age and gender, and that overall appearance of safety it is positive. And there's also, we can't say that this is a causal explanation, but it is a provocative piece of information. So we've asked these questions. Now let's ask, does it matter that they're not that well designed for some people? And does it matter how large those groups are? It seems like it might. And in what specific ways might that matter? And ultimately, how might we do a better job of that? Sometimes the solutions are not necessarily really expensive solutions, like the SAB Miller example. So if you were to be the designer in this context, whether you're an urban planner or a student studying architecture, trying to figure out how would we design better cities in the future, first I want to ask you, where are we on this? Where is our conversation right now? And why? Somebody? So we have some data, right, that is kind of questioning some fundamental assumptions, and that data is not making us look very good. So, those of us who have been designing cities for a while. So then what we're probably going to do is be doing some kind of human-centered design study here, developing a hypothesis and moving forward. So yeah, and I would say there's some of this, right? So we can see that there might be some disproportionate effects, but we don't yet know more than what this large-scale data study did about what the experience is like. Because probably it's not just about people over 50 and women. It's probably much more granular than that. And there are probably other groups that fit this bill. So it's probably about something else than just purely about demographics. All right, let's move to how you would get a little bit deeper in this problem. So design thinking or human-centered design is really ethnography for the purposes of idea development. So we learned a lot of tools from ethnography as a methodology, which tends to be used in qualitative research. And then we've simplified those tools to move a lot faster in a kind of product and service environment. And what we're trying to do with these tools is start with open eyes. So even if you're an expert in your field, an urban planner in this example, you want to interview people about cities and observe their experience of cities as if you know nothing, which is challenging to do. But if you go in assuming that, or asking questions like, don't you like this road that I built? That's not going in with open eyes. It's more about asking questions about, well, how do you move about the city in a given day? And then asking lots of follow-up questions to understand what their experience is like. So you're learning from people while suspending judgment. There's an IDEO project that was on, have you heard of the company PillPack, actually? PillPack became a really big company in the US, but it started as a project at IDEO. And this was about seniors taking their medicine. And there's a lot of non-compliance. And so what they ultimately did was create, your medicine in a tiny pack that would be sent to you. So you didn't have to find it in all the different bottles and mess with bottles. But one of the things they found, this was a real participant in the study, when they asked her, do you struggle to take your medication? She said, oh, no, it's totally fine. And they say, do you mind showing us? Just let us watch your process. And so she gets this one and this one. She gets out a table saw. Do you know what a table saw is? And opens one of the bottles with a table saw. They're like, wow, that doesn't seem easy at all. So she's saying that it's easy, but it's only as a design researcher when you connect what the person says with the observation, that you see that she may be used to this. We call this a workaround, but like this cannot be, this is not a good design, right? And so that gave them, that was one of the insights for them, that opening the bottle is a bigger problem than we have considered it before. And so we could take out the bottle opening of the experience, from the experience. It's also about not judging. So they didn't say, gosh, what a ridiculous way to open a bottle. They didn't make her feel bad from that. So we're inferring an opportunity at the cross-section of what people say and what they do or use. So that's our job. This is part of why people can't tell you what the future should look like, because that's our job to do it. So we're looking for inconsistencies and workarounds and ultimately opportunities. And our goal is not to come up with the product in this moment, but to come up with the criteria for a product, right? So the criteria would be a bottle that's simple to open, or like a simple opening mechanism would be maybe one criteria. So we triangulate across multiple methods. So from quantitative to focus groups, interviews, diary studies, and observational studies. This is more on this side of things. And you're often trying to collect data from more than one source. And because you don't have validity in the same way that you have in statistics, your validity comes from a couple of things. One is you see the same pattern from two totally different sources or methods. And two is you see that pattern begin to repeat itself. So each additional person you're talking to is also struggling with the bottle. And so, yeah, we're more on the qualitative side, and we are trying to understand the why behind the pain points that people experience. And that's helping us get out of our own heads as practitioners and challenge some of our biases by exposing us to that. So at that point in a project, we often set a big mission, and we try to set it as big as we can. So these are some company missions. I'll just read these out to you in case you can't see them. So for Google, their big mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Microsoft's big mission at the time was to put a computer on every desk in every home. And John F. Kennedy's big mission at the time was to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely. So the next example I'm going to give you is in the world of fashion. This is with Gucci Group and their parent company, Kering, which owns lots of other luxury brands in addition to Gucci. And the question we started with, the big mission question, was how might we help consumers and designers make sustainability the new luxury by 2025? That's a big mission, but it's also, projects are a lot more exciting when you have a big mission. And they're framed big enough that you can go places where you might not otherwise go. There's a bunch of different companies that we interviewed. This just shows you a little bit of what the process looks like. So we begin to structure unstructured data. We make notes and pull out kind of codes so that we can connect more and more data. Eventually, we get a list of themes, and those themes become smaller and smaller until we focus on what ultimately is a new insight. So these are examples of what are not insights. So a lot of my students will start with calling these insights. So an insight is not a fact that already occurred or an observation that they perceived or noticed. It's not a theme, and it's not a trend. An insight needs to be, for it to be useful to us in this context, needs to feel like a revelation. It needs to expose some kind of underlying truth or something unexpected. It needs to kind of flip our understanding in a powerful way of a project. So on the fashion study, the biggest insight for us was that, we initially saw this as a consumer problem. Like, will consumers accept a bamboo bag at the same price rate, or at the same price point as the bag that is, a leather bag that they might tell themselves they're going to pass on to future generations? Like, are we able to sell sustainable materials in that way? And then talking to consumers, we actually had to talk to designers first to see, what are the materials we should be asking about. And in talking to the designers, we realized that first we actually have to focus on designers, because designers are the ones who make the decisions of what to even make things out of. And fashion is a very fast-paced industry, often putting multiple collections out a year. And most designers today were trained, 10 or more years ago in traditional materials. And so we can't even get to the consumer part of this problem unless we can get designers making different materials choices. And so what we ultimately did was build not a 10 euro, but a 10 million euro materials science lab that all of the companies within Kering, so that's Gucci Group, Alexander McQueen, Stella McCartney, Balenciaga, they compete directly in the market. So they needed to be able to access the latest material science secretly and still compete with each other. And so that had to be funded sustainably at the holding group level. And then another big part of sustainability innovation in fashion is in the supply chain. And we developed the first ever environmental profit and loss statement that was first rolled out and perfected by Puma, which Kering also owns, and then rolled out across all of the Kering companies by today. So this project is on track for 2025. A lot of innovation came out of this, but mostly it was focused on how do we empower designers to make this shift. These are some example products from that. How's everybody feeling? Good? All right, okay. Just need a little breath. Be comfortable. We're getting kind of in the final stretch. So why does design thinking matter? We've talked about a lot of these different examples. We've talked about some of the things that are powerful with this. But really it helps us improve our understanding of the problem, who experiences the problem, and the moment, the context in which they experience this problem. It can help, because we improve in those ways, it can help us prevent avoidable failure. So, one project some of my students had years ago was a water bottle that tells you all of the pathogens that are in it. I'm like, I don't know, who wants that here? You do? Oh, interesting. You're like the first person. I want to talk to you later. Anyway, but I've given that example in a lot of different rooms. Nobody really wants that in mass. And just asking these questions can kind of give you some feedback on maybe these students should spend their time working on a different project. It can lower the opportunity costs of bad design. So if those students work on that water bottle project for 6 months, that's 6 months that they're not working on another project that could go somewhere and go further. It helps us focus on problems that really matter to people. So when we think back to our city design problem, and we don't care about cities that matter to cars. Cars, were never really the intention, but somehow we've gotten to the point where we're designing for cars over people. So let us come back to designing for people. And then it also is a fundamentally multidisciplinary process. So from the very beginning, you have the engineers, the behavioral scientists, the designers, and increasingly often the business people on the project and learning, in context, which is, still not the norm in a lot of places. But that does something that's pretty powerful in addition to opening up the contribution from those different people. And that's that if you don't do that, often everybody thinks their part is a little more valuable than everybody else's part, right? So I often hear, oh, we'll do the design part at the end, you can make it pretty. And it's like, well, that's not really what design is, and it's kind of a little bit mean, And you hear some people say that about the business part, or about the behavioral part, or about the engineering part. Let's just get a team of undergrads and we'll have them solve this thing. Well, all of those little interactions add up, and they're just kind of mean in a way that nobody's really addressing. So if you can start with a process that values every contribution from the beginning, you can create kind of a more collaborative environment and minimize some of those little misconceptions. So I'll give it, this is an example related to our city project. So this started with, how might we build a product that can be a catalyst for more human-centric cities? So this is a scooter from a long time ago. This is a woman on it. This is like early 1900s. And we clearly didn't, that scooter's no longer around, although there are new scooters, so we are moving in that direction. But we began to study how different people move through cities. And 3 of the easiest lightweight mobility solutions are a bicycle, a skateboard, or an electric skateboard. And then we just looked at, what do female commuters tend to be wearing as they're deciding, what vehicle to use to go to work. And if you're, actually, this is a pretty good example. Let me really demonstrate it. This is kind of, I need to somehow ride a bike like this, or a skateboard, or an electric skateboard. It's not going to work, right? And so if you want half the population moving on those types of vehicles, which are ultra efficient, you're not going to make them dress differently or change, right? You need to think about solutions that would maybe work for them. And so we started thinking about a cargo carrying vehicle. This is a really futuristic project, but after doing the human-centered design part, these are our criteria. This product needs to have broad demographics. It needs to be portable, it needs to be stable, it needs to go as fast as you would kind of naturally move as a human, walking, running, or biking. It needs to have range, if it's electrical, and it needs to be able to navigate common urban hazards. So this is what we built. This is Jeff Bezos testing it out. It's called the Jitta Robot. And again, it's very futuristic as a concept, but this is a robot that just follows you around. So it's doing this ultra accurate map of basically your legs and kind of following your legs around. And the idea is that not tomorrow, but in the future, that picture where we saw of New York City of a lot of different things happening, that we will have much smaller vehicles, like little kind of tiny vehicles that are moving cargo and people around, and we'll have a greater diversity of kind of machines that might be moving around in what are currently roads, and or might be moving on bike lanes and sidewalks. So this is Gita. It carries up to 44 pounds. In our human-centered design research, that's the weight of 2 full grocery bags on average, which is also the most common load that people are carrying around in an urban environment. And it goes up to 20 miles per hour, which is biking speed, but most of the time would not be operating at 20 miles per hour. And it follows humans, but they can also follow each other, like little ducklings, delivering packages in the city. And so when we were doing our research, we also asked how people want to use this. And many people are just excited about it. They say, I just need this. There's a pretty big population, almost 30%, that was reaching out to us to extend their mobility in some kind of way. So we wanted to study that a little bit better. So we worked with a rehabilitation hospital that had patients with cystic fibrosis or a torn ACL, some other different medical mobility related definitions. And we talked to those people and we got great participation. We did learn that a lot of people might need mobility assistance but don't like to admit it. And then there's some trust and privacy issues that were really important to navigate, partially because people don't want to admit mobility limitations. It was challenging because people, when you talk about robots, like to think of science fiction, right? So to talk about a real product in the future is not always easy. And then so most of the data is organized by medical label. And so when we're trying to figure out the market size for this, we actually want the data to be organized by like how many people struggle to lift 10 pounds, or how many people struggle to walk at the speed that they want to walk. So the data is not really organized for us to size the market very effectively. But we developed the criteria that would meet that group. Ultimately, the product has gone in a different direction than this, but we've done this for each group we were interested in. These are the early days of the team. And here's the broader vision of this product. A fun future to imagine. But this, it's a real company in Cambridge, Massachusetts now. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I want to have plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to go through this really quickly. Do some of you know the show Seinfeld? So Seinfeld became one of the most successful shows ever in the US. And it's a good example of you can't just ask people what they want in the future, because the pilot for this show bombed. Nobody liked it. They all thought they were stupid characters and said that this show shouldn't happen. Another example is the iPad. When the iPad first came out, people really didn't like this idea. They said it's going to be for old people, it's for consuming, not producing interesting content, that it sounds like a feminine hygiene product, which is a pad in English anyway, but like people hated it. And then of course, that turned out to not be true. That was also true for the ear pods. People didn't like those initially. They've been very successful. I'm going to skip ahead. So a couple of very simple tips and tricks. You can learn a lot more about this. When you interview people, your goal is to understand, their thoughts and motivations and values and behavior around a context. Like that's your design of your question should help you understand those things. And then, often instead of saying, would you like an iPad, what you're really wanting to do is evoke stories. So when is the last time that you, like, how do you consume media today? You know, on what type of device? Just walk me through your media consumption. Or what's a technical product for consuming media that you especially loved in the past? How'd you learn about it? You know, where'd you buy it? How did you use it? What's one that worked that never worked for you at all? You thought that it would be great and you just don't use it anymore. Tell me about what that process was like. And then you are beginning to kind of match up what people say and what they do. All right, so quickly, the future, these are some of the things that I think are going to be happening next. So I think we'll see more and more interdisciplinarity in education and in industry. I think we'll be going beyond design thinking. I think we already really are. So Q, which owns IDEO, their latest new company is called BE Works, and that stands for Behavioral Economics Works. So I think we're going to be seeing design thinking and large-scale data science methods come together. I think we'll be having more conversations about designing to be respectful for users, not just user-centered design to get them to use and engage, but how do you maybe help them with their own long-term goals in a more respectful way? Get them to the gym, help them learn a difficult course or something like that. How do you build in respectful nudges? I think conversations about ethics and design will be increasing, and human-computer interaction as a field is going to grow really dramatically. And lastly, I think in the boardroom right now, companies that are really, really good at data science, they are like Pinterest, for example, they are beginning to express that the data science side is too powerful. It's increasingly too powerful. And nobody ever gets fired for making a good data-driven decision, right? But sometimes that's going to put a company in the long run in just a place of incremental innovation rather than really taking some bigger risks. And that creative strategy side, the role of a creative director or equivalent in a company has been diminished a little bit with the rise of a CTO or a data science head. But I think there's a recognition that in the future we actually need to make these both kind of equally powerful so that they can challenge each other and keep up the risk-taking nature of some of these companies. So that's it.
Some time for questions.
I'm working primarily with software, and I have some experience with leading design teams. And there's this one thing I've kind of noticed that it's kind of observing this pattern, where usually you start off with this great technology and this great team with great insights about how the user works. So what happens? They go to the drawing board and they come up with some ideas. Usually those ideas somehow they become meh-ish, They're okay, let's start with this basic idea and then let's go and iterate on top of it. So they take this kind of meh-y, kind of average idea, and then they go into building the prototype, and then they go into the cycle when they're tweaking minor details. So they stretch out the time, there's no time, we have to complete the project, and they end up just with an average idea which has been iterated a few times. So what would be your advice into escaping this kind of pattern? Because mainly I think the problem becomes when you start to get attached to this average idea, and you kind of can't drop it and go back to the drawing board because you've invested too much.
Yeah, great. So I don't think, design thinking is one method, right? So it's one method of helping us structure decision-making in an innovation project. And I think it's particularly relevant when either you're in a pretty new field, so you have limited, contextual and evaluative understanding, or your field has changed. So if you're in the publishing industry right now, your assumptions aren't working, right? So I think that's a time to invest in these types of projects. But everything at the end of the day, resources are limited, and these are pretty labor-intensive projects to do really well. So I just don't think it's practical to be doing them all the time. I think it's useful if you can have some kind of pulse. So you have this understanding of the target market, and like every once in a while you check in, our fundamental assumptions, the equivalent of that criteria for an effective solution, is it still about right? And probably it is for a while. The second piece of getting attached to a mediocre idea. So first, like, if these projects aren't generating a genuinely novel insight, they could maybe be done better. It may be that, that team they just didn't get to the point of a novel insight. And if you don't have a genuinely novel insight, you probably don't have a really interesting product, right? So if you think about the pill pack one, if they were just like, oh, people have problems with behavioral compliance of taking their medicine. If that's the insight, that's not an insight. That doesn't lead to pill pack. That just leads to probably an app that reminds you to take your medicine, and there are lots of those and they don't work very well, right? So one is to be checking that the team is actually getting to that. And two is that, there's some research from the scientific literature on parallel prototyping and the value of keeping multiple ideas alive until one is a clear winner. And part of why that works really well is because it keeps you from being precious about an idea that is not yet proven. That's a little tricky to do in the practicality of a business, right? So like usually we're talking about the kind of quick and dirty prototyping, not like fully coding 2 versions of software, right? So you want to somehow have a way to parallel prototype before committing things. And I can send a paper your way if you want to share it to people.
Thanks, Beth. Any tips on how to avoid observational bias in the, let's say, in acquiring feedback from potential users?
Yeah, I think, defining what behaviors you're observing, and it is hard, if not a little bit humanly impossible, to truly look at something with open eyes, but to really push yourself to do that as much as possible is helpful. And then I think it's also helpful to have multiple observers. So there's the product version of this, and then there's the research version of this. In the research version of this methodology, we need to have multiple raters of a certain level of capability to evaluate a problem. So that's impractical for products, but that is methodologically the right answer. So you have different perspectives, and it's in the different perspectives on where those aligned. So you're looking for high inter-rater reliability of multiple perspectives. So the point at which, like if you have 5 people observing a thing, 4 people observe the same thing, that is a higher quality observation than if 1 out of the 5 observe it.
Just going in with a blank piece of paper rather than a set of questions? Because I think we're aiming for qualitative rather than quantitative here.
Yeah, so observation is usually not with questions. So the other would be, that's an interview. That could either be a participant interview where you're somehow embedded, or that could be a non-participant interview which is what most people are doing. And then observation is more like, so do you know the Swiffer? Swiffer is it's like a mop with a removable thing. You probably have it with a different name. But the original Swiffer was designed with this kind of process. And when they talk to people about cleaning floors, people say, oh, I like to have a clean floor. And then they show the implements that they use. They have a mop, a bucket, water, and then they clean the mop afterward, and they have some cleaning solutions. And they found that nobody says, I want to clean the mop. They want a clean floor. And they were spending half the time of cleaning on cleaning the mop. And so Swiffer's big insight was that if we can delete the cleaning them up experience, then people will want that. And that's, looking at the process of how people clean a floor, that's observational. You're not asking questions, you're just watching. And you want to get as close to the authentic experience. That's why a lot of these, professionally, this often happens in people's homes. It happens in the context. And in the pill example, that's in this woman's home. And they wouldn't have seen the table saw if they asked her, and they wouldn't have seen it if they hadn't been in her home. So that's the difference between those.
Between sitting here and having some food.
Thank you. Thank you for great insights and also a crash course in design thinking. I have a more general question about design thinking discipline. So you mentioned Stanford D School, and I would assume that most of top universities have a design program or design school. Is there a difference in approach to design thinking in East Coast or Stanford University and Harvard, or is it very similar?
I think the core methodology is pretty similar, and you also have the Hasso-Plattner Institute in Berlin is very active. But there are so I spent some time at the D School, and there are some things that I just can't get away with doing with my students at Harvard. Like often people would meditate at the start of class in Stanford, right? And like there's no way my students would act like that's a normal thing to do, And so there's some of the like kind of touchy-feely parts of what works in San Francisco don't necessarily translate. I'll leave you with a story that's actually from the research. So I in my Ph.D., I studied success and failure inside of IDEO and Fortune 500 companies. And they actually had systematic differences in innovation across their global network. So like, the New York office is consistently more innovative than, the Chicago office or whatever. And it's not that obvious why. It's not about resources or talent differences. So that was a study. That meant that I kind of lived inside of IDEO for a year. So I was in their Shanghai office, their Chicago office, and their London office. And one day in the Shanghai office, this package arrived. And this is a team building package from San Francisco. The office is in a skyscraper in Shanghai. And it is this giant pot and a lot of cards, really beautiful cards that you're supposed to write your frustrations on and put them in the pot. And then you're supposed to go outside and burn it and stand around and hold hands and dance around it and celebrate, burning your frustrations. And I was like, oh my gosh, did not go well. And so the first people go, and most of them were expats in the office. And they say, oh, I'm frustrated that the 3D printer is backed up. I'm frustrated that, the train is not on time or whatever. And I had never thought about this, that we have this concept in the US of being really honest. That does not mean be really honest. And so I had never thought about it. But then, the director was saying, oh, come on, to the people who are locals in the office, we need you to stand up and express frustration, which is culturally not so common, but the director is saying you have to do it. And so then some people would stand up and say, I'm frustrated that I don't get paid enough, or I'm frustrated that, and some things that I was like, oh no, that's not what we really meant, even though that is a good frustration. Anyway, and then we take this thing to the roof of this skyscraper and light it on fire, and we limply touch hands, and this was not only not a team building effect, this was like a team estrangement effect for the next couple of weeks. So these, it's a very long answer to your question, but not everything about it translates to different areas.
Okay, thank you. Let's do a round of applause. And